didn't have any equipment. I didn't have bread flour. I just started one day because I decided that I wanted to learn how to make bread as a part of my goal to be self-sustainable for my family. I think we can all relate to when COVID happened, you know, not being able to go to the grocery store and to be able to buy the normal things that we would usually get. So that kind of got the wheels turning for me about how I can start planning for my household in the event that something happens so that we can be self-sustainable. Shalom. Welcome back to the City of Refuge Homestead. Today we are going to be making sourdough bread. So the first thing we need to do in order to get started, you need a sourdough starter. So I know this is my first video doing sourdough bread. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to circle back and take you guys through how to make the sourdough starter. So this right here is my sourdough starter. I have nursed this for, I want to say, over 2 years. Once sourdough starter is developed, it is resilient. I traveled with my starter from New Jersey to Tennessee and he did not die. So take a look at Herbert. That's the name we call him, Herbert. So this is sourdough starter. Disregard all the crustiness. It is what it is. This is our Herbert. And this is our yeast. This replaces the traditional yeast you would buy at the store. Yah has created it where we can extract the yeast from our microbiome in the air and it becomes fused with flour and water to develop a sourdough starter, which is yeast. So I plan to take you guys through the process at some point to walk you guys through how to create your own sourdough starter. But for this video, I'm just going to show you how to make bread. So if you notice, he has a little bit of water inside. That's normal. You just pour that out. You can discard some of the excess yeast out of the bottom. However, you don't have to if you're going to be using the discard for something else. That's normal, guys. He's just not active. So when your yeast is not active, that's what it looks like. And when it's not active, it just means that he's basically asleep. And I'm referring it to he because I call this Herbert. This is the name of our yeast, Herbert. So I'm just going to discard some of that water and then I'm going to add in some flour. I like to use bread flour. However, I know that you can use all-purpose flour, wheat flour. Don't let it stop you if you don't have the perfect things at home to get started, because you can use those and still make delicious bread. Bread flour just makes the bread a little bit more chewier and has a nice bounce to it. But you can use all-purpose, you can use wheat. Don't let that stop you from making a sourdough bread. So I'm just going to discard some of the water and then I'm going to show you me adding some flour and some water to get Herbert started. So the recipe that I use, it calls for 1/2 cup of yeast, sourdough starter, which is Herbert. But I like to double my recipe because I make 2 loaves of bread because my family will literally devour it in like a week's time. So I'm just adding in, I'm not exact with the measurements at this point. I've been doing this for about 2 years. I'm just giving you what I know and what I've learned over the course of 2 years. But I'm gonna put about a cup, it's a little less than a cup of flour into my sourdough starter. And then I'm gonna add water, and the consistency you're looking for is pancake batter. So this is about a cup. Normally, you'd probably get away with a half a cup if you're making 1 loaf of bread. So I'm just going to add my flour. This is about a cup of flour. And then I'm going to add my water. I'm just eyeballing it. Like I said, I don't, at this point, I just kind of eyeball it. And you pretty much just mix. And right now what you're doing is you're feeding the yeast with flour so that it can become active. And you just want to mix it up well to try to get some of those lumps out. It's okay if there's a few lumps, but I don't like it lumpy. So this is about pancake batter-ish. And normally, you know, I see people, they would discard their sourdough before they add the flour. I'm not doing that. You can do whatever works for you. Once you kind of know the basics of making the bread, you pretty much can do what you want. Like I said, sourdough does not die. All right, so now Herbert is mixed up. It's got like a nice, I don't know if you guys can see that, a nice pancake batter consistency. I was gonna add a little bit more flour, but I think it's okay. It's got a few lumps, but that's okay. Now we're gonna scrape the sides down. I like to do that so that I can monitor my yeast to see if it's rising and active. So what I normally do is I keep a rubber band on the side of my container so that I can monitor how active my yeast is. So when you're activating your starter, you will notice that it will start to rise and it will fall, and it's going to create bubbles. And that's how you know when your yeast is active. So right now he's fed, and over the next couple of hours he's going to start to rise and fall and produce gas, and that's how you know that he's ready. And I've actually fed my starter and left it overnight and made bread the next morning, and it was fine. So sourdough yeast is forgiving, so you don't have to feel overwhelmed or, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Afraid of making a mistake. Sourdough is very, very forgiving. And like I said, this is yeast that comes from, this is what Yah created from the earth. So it's much better for you. Once you have fed your starter, you want to cover him. I just kind of leave it open a little bit. So this is what I do. Doesn't mean it's the right thing. I get the good results every time, but you know, you can do whatever you have, use whatever you have to make it work. Then you would put your starter in a warm place. I like to leave him on the counter near my oven and let him do its thing. And then if you could see, just quickly, we just added the starter and you could see that there's bubbles already. I don't know if you could see those bubbles, but he's already starting to become active. So once your starter is going and strong, it doesn't take that long for him to become active. And you just check back throughout the day. I know I'm a stay-at-home mom, so I can check back throughout the day. But if you're somebody that works sincerely, you can start your starter, your sourdough starter in the morning, come home from work, knead your dough, let it sit overnight, either on the counter or even in the refrigerator, and then come back to it the next day to bake. So now that we fed our starter, I will check back in with you guys once Herbert has become active. I have a book here that I keep of all of my recipes that I like. This is my dad, who passed away when I was 11. He loved to cook, So whenever I pull this book out, I'm always reminded of him. And then I also have my Grandma Christine, who I'm named after, and my mom and my family. Here is part of my recipe book. So I called it Nanny's Recipes. What did I call it? Nanny's Family Recipes. And all it is just a printout of all the recipes that I liked over the years. I just wanted to give you a quick update on the sourdough starter. If you can see the bubbles, that's how you know it's active. And if you can tell, let me see if I can get it a close up. You see, it's been rising and falling, rising and falling. Okay, so I hope you guys can see where my rubber band is, and you can see the line up here. That means the sourdough starter has risen and fallen, and that is a good sign. That lets you know that your sourdough starter is active. And if you look inside, see all those beautiful bubbles? So the recipe calls for a half a cup of starter. That is to make 1 loaf of bread. So a half a cup of starter, 1/4 of a cup of lukewarm water. You don't want to skip that step. If your water is too hot, it can kill the yeast. And if it's too cold, it will take longer to activate in the flour, if that makes sense. And then you're just going to add some salt. And this recipe calls for all-purpose flour, but I use bread flour because, like I said earlier, it's just a little bit more chewier. It has a better bite to me, in my opinion. But you can use all-purpose flour. You just do what you got to do. Use whatever you have at home. You can use wheat flour. You can use rye flour. You can use all-purpose. Do what you have at home, just so you can experiment. Don't feel like you have to run out and go to the store and buy all these ingredients to be able to make a beautiful loaf of bread, because you don't. I just prefer bread flour. I'm doubling my recipe, so the recipe that I'm putting up is, like I said, is only for 1 loaf of bread. So I'm going to be doubling everything. So I need, for my recipe, I need a full cup of sourdough starter. So I'm going to just do a full cup. If you see that, that is so bubbly. Hope you guys can see that. Them bubbles are so beautiful. I love this part. This is my favorite part. So we have 1 cup of sourdough starter, and it smells so yeasty. I love sour. It smells so good. It really does smell delicious. So I'm gonna put that in. Now I'm gonna get my lukewarm water. I had some water that I started in a teapot. So I'm gonna check it to make sure that it's lukewarm. If it's not lukewarm, I'm gonna wait, because this is an important step. You don't wanna kill your yeast. It is resilient, but if you overheat the sourdough starter, it will die. So just be careful, test it, put your finger in there, make sure that it's lukewarm, like you'd be giving a baby bottle. Okay, I'll be back. So I have my mason jar here. My water is a little too hot for my comfort. So I'm gonna put it in the mason jar, measure it out, put it in the mason jar so that, and the white stuff is obviously just starter from the residual starter from here. So I'm gonna let it sit in the mason jar until it becomes the temperature that I like. I'm just eyeballing. I mean, this is 1 cup, but I have to do 2 and 2/4 of a cup. So essentially that is 2.5 cups. So I'm just gonna eyeball the half So it's still too warm. I'm gonna let it sit and then we'll come back and I'll show you how I incorporate all the ingredients. All right, so while we're waiting for my water to cool down for my sourdough bread, what do we do with the extra? So this is when a lot of people will discard the starter all the way down and then stick it in the refrigerator. I'm not gonna discard it because I use the discard sometimes during the week for like pancakes and other things that I might be using. Instead of, you know, just putting it in the trash, you can use the excess to use in your other baked goods. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna leave it as it is. And you can also just leave this on your counter. I know a lot of people who just leave this on their counter, you know, they feed it, and you know, those are people that make bread religiously. I probably make bread once every couple of weeks. I'm not a big bread person, bread eater, but my son and my husband, they both love bread. So that's why I double the recipe and make 2 loaves, and that will last me about 2 weeks, and then I'll have to make bread again. So I usually will take my sourdough starter and just pop it back in the refrigerator. So our yeast is in here. My water is lukewarm. I'm just gonna add my water. And if you can see this sourdough starter, the yeast, as you can see, the yeast is floating. That is a good sign. If you see your yeast floating when you put your water in, that's another indication that you have very strong starter and you have a good likelihood of your bread rising. All right, so now you're gonna add your flour, and then you're gonna add your salt. They say you should always add your flour before you add your salt, but honestly, I've done it both ways and it really doesn't make a difference. I'm gonna add 6 cups of flour, and then I'm gonna give it a rough stir, and I'm gonna show you what that looks like. And then you have to let it rest for, I think, 30 minutes, and then you come back to it. And then we'll do my favorite part, which is stretching and folding. So we got 1, 2, and at this point, you're gonna start to incorporate a little bit. Halfway or a quarter of the way, you're gonna start to incorporate it. This is where I like to add my salt. And like I said, it really doesn't make a difference if you add the salt in there with the water or not, but this is just me following the recipe. So it calls for 1.5 teaspoons of salt. So I'm going to use 3 teaspoons because I'm doubling my recipe. This is a 1/2 teaspoon, so I'm gonna even double this. So it's really gonna be 6 because this is a 1/2 teaspoon. It might seem like a lot of salt, but it's not. I use Himalayan sea salt. Some people use Redmond salt. Honestly, use what you have at home. Don't make it crazy for you. Don't make this process any more complicated. Use what you have at home. If you have regular table salt and you want to bake bread and you feel like you have all the ingredients and you want to do it, go for it. Use what you have at home. Don't worry about buying special salt. It all comes together in the end. And I'll show you a picture of what my bread looked like when I first started making sourdough. So don't worry about that. So I'm just gonna incorporate the salt. I like to do it like this. You definitely want that salt to get in there. So remember, this is only 2 cups. So we have a lot more flour to add. We have 4 more cups of flour to add. So I like to really mix it well so the salt can be incorporated evenly. So I'm adding another cup. And I'm just using a fork because it's just easier. And then I will switch to my hands, which I prefer anyway. So we're halfway there. So we got 4. You can use a spatula, but I find that, to me, I think the fork works better. To me. As far as like getting under there. So we're at 4. Starting to come together. We're at 5. And you want to make sure that between every cup, you are incorporating it. So it's almost time to use your hands. This is the last cup. Incorporating the last cup. This should be a shaggy dough. You're not going to really knead it. It should be a shaggy dough. So right now, all you're doing is trying to hydrate the dough. You want all the flour to soak up the water, and your dough should be shaggy, just like this. It's okay if it looks like this. It's just a shaggy dough. We're not to the part where it's gonna be smooth yet. So right now, I'm just trying to incorporate all that flour so that it can hydrate. I don't want any dry bits at the bottom, or at least too many dry bits. And it should be shaggy. It should look like this, shaggy. This is my favorite part. I'm just trying to get all the flour to be incorporated, and then we're gonna let it rest. See, this is what it should look like. It should be shaggy at this point. It's not gonna be pretty. There's a little bit of bits at the bottom. I just want to try to incorporate that in the middle. This is what I do anyway, to try to get some of those pieces in there so it can be incorporated. So I'm just stuffing those pieces in there. So now, you're gonna let it sit with a towel. You can use what is called a tea towel. I don't have a tea towel. I've never purchased one. I just used an old pillowcase. This is what I've used. So make it work with whatever you have at home. You don't have to go on Amazon. I mean, if you prefer to get a tea towel, you can. But for the sake of just getting it done and being able to practice the skill, find an old pillowcase. It's light and airy, and then you can just throw it over your bread and let it rest. So right now we're gonna let the bread rest for about 30 minutes, and then we're gonna check back in on the bread and see how it's doing. So it's been about 30 minutes, and now we're gonna check our dough. So this is what it looks like. And at this point, see, don't be afraid if it looks like that. I know when you look online, it looks all beautiful, but it's not gonna look that way yet. Once your dough is hydrated, you can start to stretch and fold, and I'll show you how easy it is. You pull it into itself and turn. 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 And you're gonna do this about 4 times before you go to bed. Now some people will stretch and fold 1 time, let it sit, and then let it sit for 8 hours to rise overnight. I personally like to stretch and fold about 3 times. So in about 15 to 20 more minutes, you come back, check on your dough, stretch and fold and turn into itself, stretch and fold and turn into itself, and then you'd go about your business and do the same thing. I'm gonna be doing the last stretch and fold for the night. And then I am going to put it on my counter to ferment overnight. And tomorrow it will be beautiful and bubbly. And then we'll go from there. Shalom, it's the next morning. The dough has rested and doubled in size. As you can see, I have a spatula that I'm going to be using to turn the dough out onto the counter. I have my bamboo basket. You can get that from Amazon, but I used a small bowl for a long time lined with a towel, and I dusted it with flour. So as you can see, I am scraping the dough out of the bowl. I'm scraping it out of the bowl carefully so that I don't deflate the dough. Now I'm cutting the dough in half because I'm making 2 loaves. I doubled the recipe as mentioned before. Setting it off to the side, and I'm going to fold the dough into itself and pull in. Then I'm going to fold the dough over itself again and pull in. And then I'm going to continue to pull in and do turns as we go. So you're going to pull into yourself and then turn. Pull it into yourself and then turn. And that's how you get a beautiful round dough. And I'm not sure if you can see, probably not, but there are some bubbles at the top. So I'm going to sprinkle a little flour. Some people use rice flour, but use what you have. You're going to put the smooth side down and the ugly side up. You're going to cover it with your towel and let it rest for another 3 hours. When you've come back, your dough should have then doubled in size again. You're going to take some parchment paper, and at this point, you should be preheating your oven to 450. So I like to take my parchment paper and crumble it up. That adds texture and it keeps the parchment paper from folding in on the sides. I'm going to tap around the basket. If you're using a cloth, if you lined it with a cloth, this is much easier. It usually just pops out, but it's sticking a little bit, and that's okay. You just have to be diligent and take your time and pull it out. As you can see, the dough is beautiful, and you're just right now I'm just trying to fix the sides to make it a little bit more round. So right now I'm scoring the bread. You have to score the bread so that the steam can come out. For the longest time, I used a razor blade. If you don't have a razor blade, you can use a very sharp knife. I purchased this tool off of Amazon. It is specifically for bread. I'll put it in the description or somewhere in the video so you guys can see what it is. I don't know the name of the tool offhand, but essentially it is a razor blade with a handle, and it makes it easier to score the bread. I'm just carving in a design. I've been practicing for a little while now. Nothing fancy, but I've been trying my hand at different designs lately. And if you don't feel comfortable, you can just do one score down the middle and keep it moving. You want to make sure that the scoring is somewhat deep so that steam can release and you can have a beautiful design in the end.
Revenue cake. Revenue bird.
Are you trying to chop me? Maybe we should just take it into
So now you want to get your Dutch oven pot. If you don't have a Dutch oven, which I didn't have in the beginning, I used a cookie sheet and a oven roaster pan top. So I was able to capture some of that steam that helps the bread to poof up when it's baking by doing that. So after 20 minutes of the bread being in the oven, you want to take the lid off so that it can brown. Then you want to leave it in for roughly 30 minutes. If you like your bread on the darker side, I would say leave it in for the full 30 minutes. If you like it a little light and less crunchy, I would start pulling it out roughly 15 to 20 minutes after you've taken off the lid. And this is the final product. So as you can see, the bread has to be hollow. I'm just tapping the bread so that you can hear what the bread sounds like when it's cooked all the way through. And this is the final product. You want to make sure the bread is cool before you cut into it. Otherwise, it's going to be very chewy. I know it's tempting to cut the bread as soon as you've taken it out of the oven. It smells good, but you really want to wait for at least 20 minutes until the bread has cooled. So I'm cutting the bread so that you guys can see the inside and all of the wonderful bubbles that were created as a result of the stretching and the folding.
It's still warm, y'all.
So I'm just going to put a little marmalade on the bread and take a bite. Very delicious. That is good. Sourdough bread for the win. I just want to thank you all for watching. I pray that you were inspired to start your sourdough journey. I look forward to doing a video on how to start your sourdough starter. I pray that you like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned and stay righteous. Thank you for watching. That's the end of the video. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching the City of Refuge Homestead.